All right, everybody. Welcome to another Cross-Examine podcast. And as we explore different ideas with you, our audience, today we decided to do something, we're going to call it a day in review. There have been so many events going on lately, but today specifically, many things happened, and we just thought it would be an interesting idea to start exploring all the events of the news that happened today.
Yeah, just in case this is our last chance in case the country just decides to split in two, at least we have one sound clip, which is like, hey, we have a little sound bite from the past here before World War III kicks off.
The sky splits open and the earth cracks.
Man, oh man, oh man. Over, a very complicated issue. Here we are again, unfortunately, with Roe v. Wade, hopefully in the way that we've been exposed to what it actually entails doesn't seem quite as bad, depending on your perspective, if indeed it's just allowed by the states to choose what's happening, then that to me, being more or less a libertarian, seems to be a win. I'm all for states' rights, and I think states should compete against one another for better results.
There's
Uh,
definitely some culpability with the news where there's the sensationalism of everything. Uh, the first headline is always going to be kind of shocking, startling, grabbing our attention because most people are familiar with Roe v. Wade as the end all be all for abortion. But then after that emotional blitzkrieg of the beginning, then upon closer inspection, we can kind of refocus and settle down a little bit and say, okay, well, so what does this actually mean? And it seems to be that the Supreme Court just said, we don't think that it's our place to make this decision. They, by overturning it, they didn't say that it's now illegal to do. They're just saying, we don't want to make a ruling on that. We're going to let hopefully the legislative branch and or state governments determine how they want to proceed in their local area.
it makes sense. I mean, they'll have to continuously deal with this. It's not the last time we've heard of this, obviously, which also makes sense that you see the different maps on like Reuters and stuff that are popping up about the states who have already had legislation ready to go just in case of this possibility. So it looks like with it happening, I mean, we see a lot of angry people who probably they either have misunderstood what's going on or they are just very passionate about whatever side they're currently inhabiting. That we'll see, I guess, what happens. Like, I really hope there's not like any sort of violent mob. It seems like it would be against the spirit either way to sort of do those kinds of things, especially like in DC of all places. Like if it's regulated to your states, then you should probably focus on whatever state you're in if you so desire to, you know, deal in polemics that way.
Legislative branch is definitely plagued with its own issues of red tape bureaucracy, but we should try to realign the rules of society by not legislating from the bench, from the judicial court rulings, and say, I didn't uh, get my way, for lack of a better description, so I'm going to have a court determine and kind of overrule the legislative branch.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the checks and balances exist for that exact reason. At least there is an attempt to, despite parties more or less corrupting that very idea. But I hope more or less that this trend of making things more state level appropriate continues, personally. But I mean, also hearing like the death threats and stuff made against the Supreme Court justices is absolutely insane. I think some people they're dishonest people just waiting for that one trigger. Like I don't think they really care about the issue or all that. Like somehow their values are not actually fully consistent with whatever that, specific thing is. I feel like more or less they hate the other side so much that they have their pitchforks ready and sharpened, and they're just waiting for the word go. And I think something like this is sort of, one of those moments.
Almost reminds me of the term trigger happy.
Mm-hmm.
Just people just waiting to get riled up over something that's in their within their belief set. And yeah, I'm not sure that threats of violence, let alone carrying them out, is really a responsible or an appropriate reaction to that. I'm also not sure what that accomplishes. That seems to be almost like a knee-jerk reaction and anger. Like, what's the result if they kill Supreme Court justices as a result of their dissatisfaction with an overturning of this ruling? I'm not sure what that does, other than really paint the the advocates for those choices in a very negative light, because it will become a representative sample, and it'll also be used by any opposition against those groups to, hey, look, they killed a Supreme Court justice when they didn't get their way. What else would they be willing to do?
And I think that's actually almost exactly the point. And without making either side into a straw man, I think there is good indication so far that both sides have polarized so much that they view the other side as the existential threat. And so I'm hoping with these sorts of like decentralization things, and like the idea being that they're afraid that winner takes all, and this is why legislating at the federal level is the dumbest thing, because you're forcing
Uh,
people in a country that's supposed to be about freedom in figuring out what's the best way by self-determination. You're trying to have this centralized like authority talk down and actually enforce these sorts of rules on everyone that don't make sense for areas of the country where they definitely have very clear demarcations in culture.
as any population grows, especially with such a wide variety of cultures within it, they have the chopped salad analogy for the US, formerly known as the melting pot. There's just so many different ways of life within the country, and we're in an exponential age of information and technology, and people have never had such access to other ideas and questioning previously held values, adopting new values, changing their perspective in good ways and in bad ways, to have this sort of strange uniformity cast over everybody, the one size fits all. It seems as we move forward, it should not be that. It should be quite the opposite, a customized, tailored application of solutions based on the needs of a community, which certainly cannot be systemically the same across the nation, let alone the world, which just it's not news from today, but when people were discussing giving medical recommendations, they should all be put into the hands of the WHO within the US, which would be letting like a Chinese run health organization determine rules that should be followed in the US, which is an interesting uh, potential.
I mean, it's a bit extreme for me to say, but it's actually in my mind traitorous to the people of the United States to do something like that. Especially because the way that we do medicine, it's not an exact science, and medical professionals know this, and they operate the best that they can with the information that they have, and it's not always, you're not always availed to all those different tests that you would have to do in order to actually have good knowledge on something. Like you can't experiment on a test population just to see what would happen before you could release it to the main population. They're actually both one and the same things. You know, you could try to do samples, hopefully through voluntary means and whatnot, but like you really don't know um, when you suggest a new procedure or medication or something like that, and you're treading on the ethical waters because there's no going back. I think that's the main problem. It's just like um, like a growing forest. It's like everything's built on top of one another, and you can't just like try to enforce the sort of like time reversibility on it. It's time irreversible. People only have one shot at health, and sometimes you can just give them a dose of poison, which means the end. It's important things to consider, and to put that into a centralized authority when we know that people's physical diversity is so enormous is ridiculous. You can't do that.
I agree. I agree.
But I think I mentioned before too that the last thing I'm going to say on this specific subject involving Roe versus Wade and kind of the medical area that we're in right now is
Sure.
that I've been very disappointed in the irreverence towards this topic from, I would say, both sides, but definitely one more than the other. And that's my own camp, because I am, and I do say unfortunately, in the pro-choice camp, because as I've mentioned to you in private, I see it as contained within the greater set theory of it must be allowed to happen. So, and I mean that like specifically for those procedures in which it has to be done, the ectopic pregnancies and things like that, where it's very clearly a case where it needs to happen in order to save the mother's life. But I've seen a lot of signs and protests lately that have just really pissed me off from the pro-choice side with just the way that they treat this topic. They just, it doesn't even seem like they care about life at all. And it's a very delicate topic because it's so loaded with all the different variations that the logic specifically has. Like you have to determine more or less what a human life is, and that it has consequences in so many other areas of our existence. Whether or not someone's in a coma or anything like that, it's contained in the larger set of bioethics. That's what I'm talking about. And so it's like a very careful and delicate subject. And I think the way that people have treated irreverently has upset me dearly.
I can understand that. You just made me think of those drivers who their foot is either 100% on the brake or 100% on the gas. there's
Mm-hmm.
there's no in between, just brake, gas, gas, brake, brake, gas. And it's certainly an incredibly nuanced field of study. It's probably an entire field of study in and of itself. There are so many different angles to approach it as, or to approach it from. Is contraception available? Are people educated in contraception and how to use it properly?
Mm-hmm.
Um, when does the abortion occur? Is it does the fetus have brainwaves, a heartbeat? How do you feel about that? When the baby can feel pain and or knows that its life is in danger and being terminated, versus kind of the legal loopholes of the partial birth abortion where you're almost entirely delivering the baby from the feet first, and then you keep the head partially in the vagina, and then you execute the baby because it doesn't have personhood, and then you finish delivering what is now a dead baby. But if you delivered it fully, then it would be infanticide, which is homicide. And then also, what if there's a case of rape, which, at least according to statistics, is less than 1% of reported reasons for seeking abortion procedures, which there's probably, or there's a potential for statistical misrepresentation because maybe people are not willing to say that it's because it was rape, or maybe this person is currently sexually active and concomitantly during that time period they were raped, and they don't know whether they conceived because of one of their consensual partners or because of the forced sex that they have. So there are many things that you may not be able to determine at all at that time as well.
Hmm.
Or if you have the ectopic pregnancy, as you had brought up, where it's simply not a viable organism that's growing inside you and will become necrotic and kill you. And from the kind of practical perspective, I would very strongly support, if I'm it's both tragic but also my position that if we're going to lose one life or two lives, I would rather lose one over two.
Absolutely. And it's obviously not an easy decision to make. And I do have to say that this is a shout out to one of the commenters on our previous videos involving this specific topic. And I 100% agree and want to also promote the message that, we need to be making the availability of orphan services, and child, what was it? Like the transfer of guardianship needs to be made easier and a little bit more widespread. Because I've known people where they tell me that, adopting their kid was like the price of a car. It's like incredibly expensive to adopt. And that doesn't seem right, for if this is going to be more of a common thing. And I would obviously prefer that maybe the child be given up for adoption instead, but we need to make those adoption services, a little bit more open. Now, I understand the concerns, of course, that are involved, but it doesn't seem like it should be that much. We should obviously conduct thorough investigations for as much as legally possible into the proposed guardianship. And I don't really know the statistics behind that. And that's maybe something that I have to do on my own in order to figure out exactly where the line is on that. But it at least seems logical to say opening up the services a little bit more would be better for society.
Yeah, I think that it would be hard to find people who disagree with that. And so that does leave me with the question of why is the current system functioning as it is then? And not only for orphanages, but also for foster care homes. And uh, I'm I'm sorry that I don't remember the exact difference, but I have brought up orphanages before, and then people have said don't forget about foster care, and so there's some sort of distinction going on there, and I just wanted to make sure that I include that as well. So anybody who was given up after being birthed
Mhm.
by someone else who decided for whatever reason to not continue to take care of them. And I know a handful of people who have at least disclosed that they're adopted, and that is interesting because most of them seem to be in, I would say, middle upper class, where their parents were pretty well to do. Maybe their parents were attorneys, or just, I didn't necessarily know what the parents were doing. But when you see a really nice home on a big plot of land in a nice area, I think it's fair to make certain assumptions about their quality of life and the financial resources and assets that back a lifestyle like that. And I very rarely would come across someone who disclosed at least that they were adopted, and it's an intelligent and loving family, but they don't have much uh, money, even though they could easily fully support adopting a child, just as many middle and lower income households do without issue. Just because you don't have a lot of things doesn't mean that you can't be great parents, that you can't provide a child with a great life, with education, with love, with food and shelter, heat in the winter, and fan in the summer, AC.
Absolutely, 100% agree. I mean, it's and to me, I mean, the problem seems to be, again, probably unfortunately too often said, but as libertarian, I really do think a lot of these problems have just been un, unable to be addressed by our government, and the proclivity for people to constantly want the feds in DC to do something about it instead of their own neighborhood, I think has gotten us to this point where we have to constantly be lobbying half the fucking population in DC to get one thing moved instead of being able to do something locally that has arguably more impact and
Is
is
it just that
appropriate for the community.
are we distracted or are we too busy? Is it because we're lazy that we've just now we want to point the finger at one person who's in charge or people who are very remotely connected to us at the highest level of something?
I think it's some of it has come down to the fact that we have a very low attention span nowadays from all of the tech crap that we're forced to ingest. It feels like we're on this runaway train of, I don't want to necessarily say like dopamine, but like stimulus, that we have so much stimuli around us that we're defaulting to these binary, very utilitarian answers for things.
I would find it interesting how many people, if you just randomly sampled people, do they know the people in the Senate and their normal representatives?
Yeah, even
And
for their own area. Do they even know the mayor of their own city?
that would be interesting. Maybe, and what I'm trying to get at here is it might be that we perceive, whether real or perceived, we view our hierarchy, our governmental organization as complicated enough, or there's so many people that we don't necessarily know who to turn to. And because it would take more than 5 minutes and a little bit of effort to figure it out, we just want to jump all the way to the top, which is kind of like our tattletale society where instead of addressing a problem with somebody or even going to their boss, we go to like the head honcho, like we skip 3 levels of organization and go to like the president, we go to the principal to get something done because we're almost just like I guess just unwilling to deal with conflict ourselves. We
Yeah.
want someone else to deal with it. I'm going to send an email to HR because I'm slightly bothered or annoyed by this situation that, given a little bit of effort on my part, I probably could solve, but I would rather just send an email to HR and let them deal with it.
Yeah, we're at a very odd time where it doesn't seem like our basic culture is dealing with modernity and even like hyper modernity, if you want to call it that, after the internet age, where things just seem to like accelerate out of control. And, obviously, like I'm using myself as basis for some of this stuff too. So I know, like, for me, it's taking a concentrated effort to not just sit down in front of the computer to watch YouTube all night and watch Netflix all night. Like I buy a bunch of books and I have made it a habit just to read a little bit. And I have a very, like my attention span has gotten better, but I know it's, decreased since leaving college. So it's like just in being honest with myself, and I wish other people would have that sort of honesty, but I don't even know if they're conscious of it anymore, that they're so hypnotized by our consumerist culture and the sort of, biases their own tribe refuses, that they're not able to slow down and think and go against the current. But going against the current is what makes you strong. It makes you more independent. You're not swept away. You have the muscles to, move where you like.
Be the salmon. Be the salmon, everybody.
I mean, I do absolutely agree with that. And that's like this self-determination stuff too, is why I'm glad, that in other news, that it seems like the gun laws are still holding for as long, as hopefully they can, because I see that as one of those, if you're living in two different areas in the country, you're having two different results. Like I can't tell the people in Montana, in Wyoming, not to have a gun when they have like a fucking bear that's sleeping on their porch, or like wolves wandering around their property at night. This is a fundamentally different experience than living in a comfy suburb, outside of Atlanta, or living in a city like San Francisco. Even though, you could make the case for having guns within cities also tries to keep you safe. And I'm for gun ownership and responsible gun ownership at that. But at the same time, I just think that it's one of those fundamental things that, like, and it's often said that the Second Amendment, protects the First, and I do also believe that.
Yes, I would say that I agree with you. And the existence of the Second Amendment and the initial state of an incredible proliferation and possession of firearms in all their forms by many people is a nice deterrent against an overbearing, overzealous government that wants to really reach, because they can reach and do different things, but uh, one thing that they haven't done is come knocking at your door for certain things, and that's because of the Second Amendment. Now,
Oh
what
yeah.
exactly can you give us an overview or a little rundown of the ruling, if you're familiar with it, that happened today?
I cannot, in all honesty, say that I know it inside and out. From what I've heard and from what it sounds like, it's also one of those things that it's really hard to tell with the state of journalism nowadays. Because you could read an article and still have absolutely no idea what they're talking about because it sounds like they just copied it from somewhere else. So you play this weird sort of telephone game. From what I understand, there is some sort of strike down of a conceal and carry regulation that was proposed in New York, which was already in place in California. And so by denying it in New York, it looks like California will have to also repeal it. And I think it
Okay.
had some sort of, I'll look it up right now, let's put it that way. But like maybe we want to talk quite briefly about what our feelings are on conceal and carry.
Sure, and that seems consistent with the brief snippet that I saw. I didn't read into it too much. Uh, the issue of concealed carry is interesting, not even from necessarily a legal perspective, but from a survival perspective, where if I were looking to be a shooter and I walk into any establishment or facility and I see someone who's openly carrying, and I see a gun on someone, that's a readily identifiable threat to me. So that's the first person that I will have to neutralize. If you obfuscate that data, then no one or everyone and anything in between is a potential response to you once you start taking action that others disagree with. So if you open fire and there are 10 other people in this building, you are potentially going up against 10 other shooters. So there's an interesting incentive and uh, like retaliation that is built into a concealed carry. And the disequilibrium of information is probably one of the greatest advantages that a concealed carry has. And I don't know what kind
Absolutely.
of background checks can be, how that plays into this. I mean, people should, in theory, still have to legally be able to own that weapon and have legally obtained it. And if they're concealed carrying it, there's no way to verify that. But also, if somebody's openly carrying, I'm not gonna ask somebody, can I check your serial number on your weapon to make sure that this is like a registered firearm somewhere, or that it's, and maybe it's not, doesn't have to be illegally registered, but I don't know. I think a lot of the things that were in place don't really seem to carry out their intended function anyway.
And in fact, they actually impose a
And they just,
cost too.
it is
So
strange that they seem to handicap all the law abiding, the otherwise law abiding citizens.
yeah, it's unfortunately a tautology
Uh,
that law-abiding citizens are law-abiding. You know, so you have those individuals who are not law-abiding will not, abide by the law, which, that should be
and
obvious to people, but at the same time, I guess it really isn't. That they
and
seem like somehow it's just by accident that these horrible things happen. That if only we had a law in place, it would somehow be different. And, it's obviously has been the case.
I understand that there are a lot of people on heavy gun regulations side where it comes from a place of love. There's probably also a large number of people where it comes from a place of a desire for control over everything. But I've I can't have some of, I need my own points kind of disproven, which is kind of one by one dissection of, like, if I wanted to carry out an active shooting situation, and I would go to a place where I think that I'm the only person with a firearm. So if I see a giant sign that says a gun-free zone, that would qualify.
That would make it a target rather than make it safe.
I think so, and I maybe it's because like this is just my position on the issue, but I can't. I'm having a really hard time um, arguing against that case. Like, can anybody disprove that, or I don't know what the term is that I'm looking for. Can someone attack that argument to convince me otherwise?
Yeah. Yeah. Cause I would even say that, like, and I know people have an obsession with statistics, but again, like statistics have only really told you like what has happened. It's not like they really have any predictive quality to them uh, that would guarantee that in the future that this exact thing wouldn't occur here. Um, Especially with something just that is as commonplace it seems now, unfortunately, with the shootings. And again, like I said, I think it would be different if it was somehow by the nature of the very weapon that it being fumbled around with, just like accidents, were causing massive harm. But these are like intentional acts. These are not accidents. Like, and I think people need to look at it a little bit more broadly of these people have more in common with a nail bomber or a pipe bomber than they do with an accidental discharge of a weapon.
Hmm.
Because it's like it's the intent and maliciousness to harm that is the precursor. It's just the gun that they use is the tool of choice.
This is very interesting, and I'm reminded now of when the news would cover children that unfortunately um, were playing around with their parents or their caregivers' guns without their knowledge, and then
Mm-hmm.
somebody, another person or the gun holder ends up shooting themselves, shooting someone else, and they portray it as like a tragedy, which it is, but they report on it in a way that there's a reasonable response, which is we can have these guns locked up. Oh, why wasn't the gun locked up? Why wasn't the gun unloaded? Why wasn't the ammo maybe separated from the firearm?
Yep.
And it's a very like I would almost say like it's a mild but appropriate correction.
Yeah, and I
Whereas
could
if
even
you had,
say in my own family, we've had a death in the family that way.
oh really, sorry.
And yeah, I mean, it is really unfortunate. It happened before my time, but everyone in the family still owns guns. We do take very good care of how we store them and everything like that now. Probably because of that, it made us more responsible gun owners, I would say.
I believe
Um,
one of my parents' cousins was out in the countryside, and they had a shotgun and they set it down over a fence, and then they climbed over their fence. But as they leaned over, then they ended up shooting themselves and died out there in the field.
That is really sad. I am sorry to hear that.
And education of it's unfortunate that like a single action can result in that death, but also the solution is knowledge and education.
Mhm.
And there's a it's a local response, whereas if there's like a shooting, it's kind of a we need to ban anyone from having these guns. And there's something interesting happening in here where I remember in health class when they're talking about smoking, they say you may perceive that more people smoke than actually do because you tend on average to notice when someone is smoking, but you don't tend to notice when someone is not smoking. We don't look at someone and go, oh, hey, that person's not smoking. You just notice people who are maybe out on break and they say, oh, like because they're performing that action, hey, look, that person is smoking. So
Mhm.
it would be interesting to look at some numbers. I know that statistics are not necessarily predictive, or if at all. Um, how many guns exist versus how many guns are used for crimes. And I'm not trying to take away from any deaths, and certainly all those deaths can be actively worked for prevention or to stop those. I don't want to call them outliers, but those events from occurring. But
Mhm.
we also have to pair that next to a really big picture. Like I remember Chipotle, they made the news because there was some sort of foodborne illness. Maybe it was like hepatitis A on lettuce or something. And they had been out for years and years and years. And it was like the first time they were in this huge uh, news segment. And so many people were like outraged, like, how could this ever happen? And for some reason, my conclusion or like my brain jumped to, I'm surprised that this doesn't happen more frequently. And I was somehow impressed in the moment that of all the people who have been served, of if you consider all the food chains, all the logistics of acquiring ingredients and transporting them, and the food care and prep conditions, that it took this long for this small number of people to be affected, like that's a really a really high success rate. So I wonder
Yeah.
if it's like that with guns, where even if we see people die, um, there's that personal agency and the personal responsibility that is responsible for the fact that more people aren't killed by guns. So yes, the nominal number is bad, but what's the ratio as well? And I think that would be interesting to incorporate as part of a full picture analysis and discussion.
Right. And I could say right away, too, that we know if you've listened to any sort of statistics on crime in the past 20 years, that we have had a substantial decrease in violent crime in the United States. And part of that has come from using data, even though I just criticized statistics. It was actually because of being able to collect data on crime. People have been able to target policing more effectively in certain areas. So, like, they were able to disrupt gang activity, areas that have become hot spots, by more effectively, making police go out there. Now, unfortunately, this has also had the side effect of certain groups of people being targeted that way, because it did come like hand in hand with profiling. So it was a double-edged sword, absolutely. Um, and that would have to be its own sort of study to look at too, to see if that reduction in crime matches, or at least hopefully exceeds, the amount of harm caused by profiling. But what I do want to say is that, um, when you mentioned about the essentially what was confirmation bias with, and I think that's exactly it. And again, that we can't downplay intent. It wasn't because these mass shootings happen because someone wasn't trained in a weapon, that they weren't trained in proper storage or in the laws abiding it. It was a deliberate attempt to take other people's lives. And I don't think we can, like I said, downplay that, because when we're talking about, we're like introducing legislation, what does that legislation do? Again, it's like law-abiding citizens by the law. So it increases the amount of cost that comes into gun ownership. And if we had an epidemic of accidents, accidental discharges, and stuff like that, then that would be the appropriate response, is to increase regulation involving the training of an individual in order to have and carry a weapon. I mean, I
And
think that's just basic logic, right?
yes, I think that I agree with all of those points. And hold on a second. Write down this timestamp because I lost my train of thought, but I have a good point here.
Oh, no problem. Let me real quick then read off what I was able to discover about the news involving this particular conceal and carry that we're talking about. So I
Okay.
guess in New York, they had some sort of, um, so let's see, under century-old law, residents seeking a license to carry a gun outside the home need to demonstrate a proper cause, which state courts have said is a special need for self-protection. So essentially what they're saying is that people would have to demonstrate that they needed some sort of extra protection that would warrant them having to have a conceal and carry, to apply for one, essentially. So I think what the Supreme Court is saying here is that it's more or less that you just need to skip that extra step because other states don't have it. I wouldn't say all, because of course, like I said earlier, California had a very similar law, which now has to be repealed because it doesn't seem to be constitutionally, um, valid.
Hmm. I wonder what kind of central authority grants the yay or nay on whether you have a valid reason to carry a firearm. I'm not sure what those criteria are then. And also, I can accept that there are governing agencies that oversee these things. Um,
Yes, I do know it's famously hard to get a gun in New York. Most people travel to different cities to get a conceal and carry and then come back to New York to live. So it's one of those cases too, I think, where like there is like either a local or county level administration that is in charge of this, and that actually does vary across. So maybe they did probably have some sort of basic state law that was like, you need this extra step. And then each county can kind of like figure out what that extra step is to be valid in their area. Or like I mentioned, it's people just left the area, went to a different state, a different city, got their conceal and carry, and then came back.
it's interesting that they're able to do that. And then it's also interesting that because that regulation was apparently in place, any centralized authority that decided they didn't agree with you, like it leaves open the possibility that they can just deny everyone's request for concealed carry, and they'll just uniformly deny everyone's request and say, "Oh, it's just not a reason to carry a concealed firearm." If you were like, there's a tyrannical government that's trying to actively stop my way of life, and maybe one day I fear they will come for me, so I want to carry, and then that very same government says, "No, that's not a valid reason." Uh, there's some weird circular control and provisions in place. They're saying,
Yeah,
"Hey,
there's
you can carry it if you want. You just have to get this authorization, which we're going to deny 100% of the time." In this,
which was
theory.
which was pretty much the case in New York City, because I think people also need to remember that New York City has had historically really high levels of crime. And so this was enacted in a way probably to protect people from, criminals, and in this case, or at least like make it harder for criminals. But then over time, you realize again that if a criminal really wants a firearm, they'll get one. And
What's
unfortunately, with something like the drug trade, that just comes standard. Like if you could smuggle in drugs, you could smuggle in guns, and that's really no problem. And if it's concealed and no one finds it, then it's only really illegal until you get caught.
so if I remember coming across something that said essentially the top three cities with the most violent gun crime, guns are illegal. Do you have any opinion on would it be worse or better if guns were legal? Like, would there
It
be
would
more
absolutely
crime?
be it would absolutely be better in my opinion. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind. I think there's too much evidence to the contrary that we've had other
Better as
countries.
in, you're saying better as in there would be less gun violence if guns were legal in those high crime rate cities?
Yes, that is correct. And
Okay.
I say that because we have plenty of evidence from not only areas like Switzerland, areas that, I'm also just talking about other countries. Other countries have, especially those that have mandatory military training. Everyone's trained in a weapon and has a weapon. And you do have less violent crime that accompanies it per capita. So I do think you would have less crime because more people are now a threat to the perpetrator.
So when you're in that facility of 10 people, the probability that it's on the higher end of those 10 people carrying a firearm is increased.
I'm going to guess that
And
none of
then
those cities are in Texas, but like I would like to be proven wrong too if that's just not the case. But at the same time, I feel like it's just too obvious otherwise.
that is fair, and that's one of the strong suits of this podcast where we're happy to be wrong if it can be shown that we are.
Mhm.
We have dynamic viewpoints that as information is aggregated and we see more and more perspectives, more of the big picture, then we start to kind of circle in, and there's always like a little bit of like uncertainty and wiggle room with exactly where we might be as individuals on an issue, but that's just no human can know it all. We have a limited time on this planet, and we have incomplete and oftentimes inaccurate information that's provided to us. Sometimes that's by design, sometimes that's just by accident.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, most of what we're doing and the reason why we're doing this to begin with is to hopefully open up I don't want to say the conversation more. That's just way too cliche. I'm literally trying to open up people's awareness to other lines of reasoning and not to just accept whatever dogma it is that you've accidentally inhabited over the years, like a bad smoking habit.
Oof.
A
Yeah,
lot of this stuff is like available on the table to question, like literally question everything, because what are you afraid of? If you come to the same conclusion as you had before, there's no danger in going down that road, and you might find even better opinions on things, clearer opinions. It's not just that the world is just this horrible place. It's you make yourself a little bit more, useful. I don't want to say it that way, but like useful to yourself as well. Like you're figuring out the ways things are moving. We're very complicated beasts. Um, we do not just cooperate and we do not just compete. We have an odd market for having both. There's just no clear idea in my mind that just because you have a gun all of a sudden means that you're some sort of criminal that's bent on, you know, outbursts of violence. That makes zero sense. It's like literally my car could do more damage faster, easier. I could like move from crowd to crowd pretty easily, and there's nothing they could do to stop me except for with another car. And yeah, I don't have like this sudden urge, and it's not the case that people have sudden urges to just go like onto the sidewalk and just start mowing down a bunch of pedestrians.
Yes.
So I guess I
There's
have a hard time that I think guns are unfortunately blamed because it's convenient. I also think in some ways that people do feel like there's less anxiety if there are less guns, but it's actually they have it wrong.
yeah, and I'm also thinking there's a phrase that says, "Do you want to be right or do you want to be correct?" And part of allowing critiques of your own position is overcoming hubris and our own. I'm not sure if it's called ego or just our worldview, our sense of I have things figured out pretty good. And sometimes people will want to be right regardless if they are correct, and so almost as a means of image preservation or some sort of strange protection of our weaknesses, we'll hold on and cling to something that maybe in the back of our head we know should be questioned, or maybe is like we we know inside that it's not correct, but we're going to go down with the ship. And so
Yeah,
that's hard
absolutely.
for it's probably hard for anybody to do. I know definitely it was hard for me earlier in my life to just really openly accept more information that is not aligned with my current conclusions. But it's okay if
Mhm.
your conclusions change. That doesn't. We might think that there's a lot of negative outcomes from that, but it's really okay, and you would you should want to believe uh, the most correct thing as more information comes out.
Absolutely. I mean, in my own opinion, like I look forward to being wrong because I can get stronger. You know what I mean? Like there's this will I have to continuously improve by any means necessary almost. And growing up, it felt like I hated how stupid I was. I mean, again, I wasn't even that bad. I graduated pretty well. I took AP classes and physics and statistics in high school, so I wasn't, the worst. But I always knew I was very aware of how much I didn't know, and it would eat away at me until I realized that that's just a fundamental strength to have, to actually lean into it and to go extreme with it and just be like, man, I am so infinitely wrong about everything. And it's fantastic because it means that I'm not held by those like beliefs. They hold no power over me because I can now move forward and to question everything until I have a more coherent worldview that is, useful to me in many ways.
We just keep on collecting data, keep on questioning, and this is a good place to be.
Absolutely. And I think going forward for all of you out there, I hope you adopt a similar mindset and you really just question your own position on things. We used to have it in high school where, we would argue from the opposite point of view, or at least we were encouraged to do so. I don't think that's really the case anymore, or that we've gotten lazy in our adulthood and we just assume like we were 18 again, like we freaking know everything. But it's useful to argue from that opposite side to really understand your position well and where do you actually stand on things. I think that, well, like, it makes you feel better overall too because you're not burdened by all of these like half completed thoughts. You have more or less straightened out and tied loose ends, intellectually speaking.
I remember doing that in high school, and that was very tough and challenging because I remember not wanting to defend the other side. Like I did not
Yep.
want to make my presentation because I wanted to be right, and that's a difficult. I mean, that just comes with age and growing, and as you get older, hopefully it becomes easier. Uh, at least it did for me, probably through hard work, being pushed by other people, challenged by other people, and being open as opposed to just putting the shield up. And you can always defend your current stance until you're proven otherwise. And you can also think, is there any merit to their side? Instead of
Hmm.
just, nope, there's no way, I have it all figured out. And that's also something that is a dangerous and just unsatisfying place to be in life when you think you got all the answers. There's no need to research any further. I've already collected and assembled all the appropriate opinions, and I'm set.
Absolutely. I mean, I can say that I'm confident in my position, not because I'm obsessed with my being right, but because it's taken a lot of thought to get here. And I know I didn't take the easy way out because I do value having that openness to change. And that's so important to have that flexibility if you really are in pursuit of the truth, which I am. And I enjoy that. I feel like I'm open about that sort of pursuit, and being open allows for that flexibility that's required to actually get at it. So I'm confident up until this point, but it could be anything. It could be just something like really small too. Like there have certainly been premises in anyone's argument that have just been taken for granted or overlooked that really could be like the hinge or the fulcrum unless on everything in which it balances. So like if that one thing is wrong, it could really change the argument, no matter how eloquent and how long and how connected it is, can
Yeah,
really undermine it.
the pursuit of truth and adding questions really places us in a unique position of reflection and introspection and extrospection. Like I say that I'm very pro-life, and then at the same time, every time I wash my hands, just death by the millions to bacteria and good riddance. So how can I say that I am I uniformly just pro-life because not only am I voluntarily and consciously killing millions of microorganisms for a selfish reason, which is I don't want to get sick. And also, there's an internal war that my body wages through my immune system that I don't have any control over.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this can just apply all the way up to like essentially, I don't know, fish, amphibians. I think it's kind of well known that at least most of us have that um, bias towards mammals, and then it kind of just like radiates out from there, like the inverse square law, where it's like we don't want to do any like untold harm to any mammal. Like for example, like if you step on it, like no one's really paying attention to all the insects they step on the sidewalk, but if you saw someone just going up and like curb stomping a puppy, it's just like it's remarkably brutal. It's like, and it's so absurd that this person would be doing that, and it would be like you would think that there's something really wrong with that person. And I think that that quick example kind of shows that bias very quickly, um, that we have kind
Yeah,
of an innate understanding, at least culturally.
yes, that's very interesting. A connection to that which we find similar
Yep.
in life, uh, not only from sentient life, like the ants and dogs that you mentioned, but also between other kingdoms and organizations of life. I mean, just people are obsessed, like we talked about in another podcast. Turn that mower on, baby. We're gonna start decapitating, beheading grass by the millions of blades at a time. I just love that smell. I just love damaging plant life. It's just uniformity, green grass, fertilizer. It's a strange thing.
Yep. I
And we
mean, the fact too that we like destroy plants in order to feast on them.
Yeah, and then some of those people surely have difficulty reconciling or even acknowledging that they're destroying life to stay alive, whether that's
Mhm.
animals, fungi, plants. Other things must go and die so that you may continue to live. And it's not a one-to-one, like just the number of shrimp that have died so that I can live, the number of chickens,
Oh
cows,
my God. I mean,
everything in between.
you've seen me eat like a shrimp cocktail ring by myself, like the amount of dead, seafood that went into my body. I mean, like I think the difference for me at least is that it's not that I'm trying to hold two things um, in opposition to each other, just like some sort of strange contradictory double speak. I am recognizing that this flesh that I'm consuming is going to nourish me. And I have like a weird spiritual connection to the food in which I'm thinking of like it does better in service to me. So
Sounds
like I
like the
have
movie Avatar.
I mean I have a respect for the food that I eat. And I always try to like, make sure that if I'm eating a mixed plate and I'm too full and I can't continue and finish the rest of it, then I at least finish off the meat portion just to make sure that the sacrifice was fully absorbed, because I would feel bad throwing it away. I know it's kind of a silly thing to do, but and I'm not saying this to justify anything, but I do see a very clear difference between us and the lower animals. And I'll say it that way. I don't care. We are superior. We are the kings of this planet.
Yeah, eventually bacteria would eat that meat that goes in the trash, but I would rather the complex formed nutrient collection that is meat, I would rather it go to an alpha predator at the top of the pyramid who has a better chance of transforming the universe that it lives in over a single celled organism or some sort of very small multi-celled organism. You want that
Yeah.
complexity to build on more complexity, not necessarily the trend back towards entropy and just like putting everything into a blender. It was like the animal did something amazing, and it was a factory that turned grass into steak and like corn and grain into steak. Just incredible.
Everything into steak. I mean, no, I 100% agree. I mean, for me too,
Sunshine to
it's like,
steak.
yeah, it's fascinating how evolution has given us these amazing things to behold. I mean, like the other thing too is that we know that ecosystems thrive on having these various levels. Like you can't just have ruminants. You can't just have the bottom tier producers. Things grow out of control and then things starve. And, we are trying to make it a better place, I think, slowly, if anything. Like, I am of the opinion that a deer dying to a hunter is probably way better than any of the other ways it could have gone.
I can see that. I can see that perspective.
But,
Building
that's
up
just,
instead
that's
of
just
building
me.
down.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, like, ruminants also terraform where they're at, which is pretty fucking sweet. Like, there's a reason why we prize manure. It really gives us like nice fertile fields, whereas like certain plants just completely destroy the soil. Like it wasn't any sort of it wasn't because of the stock market that we had a dust bowl. We had really bad farming practices.
Is that
Obviously
primarily
that's
from
a
cotton?
in Kansas, you mean like the Oklahoma and Kansas dust bowl? I think I actually don't remember what that was. It might have been cotton, but it might have also been wheat, corn, whatever. I know potatoes do horrible things to soil, which is why they end up having to be like rotated with other crops. Like you have crop rotation because we know vegetables destroy the soil of certain nutrients, and some plants do it worse than others. You could probably guesstimate that the more nutritious plant you have, the more the soil is depleted. That just kind of seems like stoichiometry. But
That's an interesting. That's probably mostly true. I think that there are certain differences with bioavailability of plant nutrients specifically. Like I know
yeah,
some people are
absolutely.
big proponents of soy, but I know soy and cotton really really deplete the ground of nutrients. And I know that there's like the cycling that you mentioned earlier, and a lot of manure, fertilizer, and other redistributions where people have to buy minerals and other things that were in the soil and put them back in before another harvest, because it's also kind of just our farming practices that we're demanding a lot from the earth.
Yeah, I mean,
Although,
like pot ash is one of those great examples too. Like going back to our earlier conversation about the forest fire, like the forest fire is necessary because those burnt goods are so good for the soil to, recuperate.
back to carbon, smaller usable components. And the thing with soy that I want to bring up is just it uses a lot of nutrients, but there are there is a camp out there that is very very against soy, and so I just as a part of the cross examination process is I think that you're very logically sound in saying that there is necessarily a stoichiometric ratio involved with nutrients that came out of the ground that ended up in the plant will be consumed by the organism that eats them, assuming that that it wasn't lost in a manufacturing process. But also, it may be in a form that is not usable or is less usable than other ways that those nutrients could be put together, or other ways that those components could be put together into different nutrients. So maybe, here's 5 nutrients that these components could be made of, but in plant X, they're not as good, or the orientation is different where it's less usable, and just to kind of open up the leave it almost
Yeah, yeah,
open
no, you're
for
100% right, and I probably should have been a little bit more careful as the empirical results probably are more substantial.
no,
I'm just
it's all good.
operating, I think, off of like an attempt at a base level understanding, and
Yes, I think what you said was good. I just happened to think about that, so I wanted to point it out.
oh
Add
yeah,
it
no,
on there. Little
absolutely. I'm glad you did.
little corollary. Hey, you got anything else that happened in the news today by chance? I really derailed this conversation, but I was just so excited that sunshine turns into steak.
No, that's all right. I really enjoyed that part too, and I hope our listeners do as well, just because it gives us a little more of an insight of who we are as characters, because we really are characters. I mean, we're people who stand way outside and are just onlookers onto the train wreck that is humanity. And we're like, well, what if? But no, I think that's all I have in the news that doesn't upset me. Besides, the dumb things that we could talk about involving like how the Flash star is a wanted fugitive right now.
Oh, I don't know anything about that.
It's just something I heard through the grapevine, but I guess this Ezra Miller fellow is wanted on many cases of child abuse.
Oh man.
Yeah, so it's another Hollywood star up to those shenanigans, which, you know, this is
Ugh.
becoming a trend. I don't like it.
We seem to have a person problem. It's you can have bad people in every agency. Not sure what the check and balance is for that, as with any other problem in society, other than awareness and education. And when people see that there's a potential for misuse, abuse, that we have to have the critical eye to know what to look for, to spot those things when we can, and to intervene, or at minimum, notify somebody else who has authority to do something about it or is willing to do something about it. Uh, do something. Do anything except be
Yep.
complacent. And if you have to be complacent, use that as anger and motivation for in the future say, wow, I let this thing happen before. Now I see it happening again. Not this time. So it
Yeah.
can, even if you take inaction as your decision or have in the past, that can influence future actions by you and by me, anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, not to be on too much of a soapbox, but like, what's wrong is wrong in this case. And don't feel like you have to just shoulder that burden. Um, and I hate to say it, but like, you don't want to let evil get away with it either. It's like we have all these superhero movies, and yet somehow I think all of us know that our society has never been more cowardly. And it feels like we need to be
Damn.
absorbing those lessons a little bit more heartily and being more defiant and assertive, and especially when it comes to those sorts of areas, because they're going to encroach. They're going to encroach because they know they can get away with it. And I think sometimes, even if the world is against you, there is validity in that stance, even if it will suck in the short run. You can make a difference because your story can really make change. And I don't think there's any harm in saying that. I want you as individuals to be self-determinate. At the same time, that requires you to take responsibility for your actions and for subsequent actions and reactions to other things that people have tried to do to you or have done to you. It's important. It's how we all keep each other in check.
I get a good cliche that actually applies quite nicely, which is not all heroes wear capes. And in this case, probably most of them don't. It's normal people who function in society who take the correct course of action, or what they think is the best course of action. And I
Mhm.
think there's some other quote that says it's always the right time to do the right thing.
Yep, absolutely. No, it's wonderfully said. Whether or not it's just being that parent that starts yelling at the PTA meetings because some sort of just like injustice was done, or the individual that reveals any sort of corruption that's happening in their area. All of these small acts of heroism uh, make society better for all of us.
I like it. I like that.
Yeah, so I think without getting too much on platitudes, we will sign off for today. But thank you everyone for staying with us this far into the conversation. I know it took some wild rides, but between the Conceal and Carry, the Sunshine into Steak, and Roe v. Wade, that's today in the news.
Today in the news. Thanks